Hello. This is awkward, so I'm just gonna quickly yap. I wrote a paper about Daniel Craft's slime. It is quite long, and people don't really like reading papers, which I completely understand. This is my attempt to reach a few more people because I am very much fixated on and obsessed with slime. Hello. And I want to talk to more people about it. And I didn't really have much to do today, and I'm just gonna take inspiration from my elders, which is Phil in the early 2000s. So I'm just filming this on my shit-ass MacBook camera, and I'm just gonna yap about it. Before I'll start yapping at I'll put a timestamp here. Before that, I'll just say a few things. My name's Zainab. My Tumblr and Twitter handles will be here, hopefully, if I don't forget. English is not my first language, nor do I respect it. I might make a lot of mistakes. My credentials for this is that I studied media and visual arts and literature in university. Basically, that's it, and I'm just obsessed with it. I didn't lean too much into theory to make it more accessible, so I'm just gonna touch on a few media theories and queer theory stuff, especially about queer film. But I will not go into a lot of detail, and I will put my paper as well as all of my resources down in the thing if you guys are interested. Other than that, what can I say? I'm gonna assume that you know quite a lot about Dan and Phil if you end up watching this. I hope 3 people watch this. That would be really fun for me. I'm gonna assume that, but I'm also gonna make a really quick recap of Dan and Phil and what this is about. And again, go to that timestamp for the main thing to start. Goodbye. So yeah, hello. This is the introduction to Dan and Phil crash course, really quick. Dan and Phil are 2 individuals called Daniel James Howell and Philip Michael Lester. They do not need me to introduce them, really. They're really popular on YouTube. They always were, they still are. Also, I have my paper here. I'm just gonna read over it, kind of. They're known as the nerdy, funny, non-threatening duo with a peculiar relationship, and I will refer to them as Dan and Phil in a casual fashion and do not use Howell and Lester because that feels weird to me. And the reason why that feels weird, I am in there as well. They have cultivated this really tight-knit audience with really peculiar parasocial bonds, and they're as parasocial about us as we are to them. They started basically building their audience since the day they uploaded Phil Is Not on Fire 1 back in 2009 on Phil's channel. It's a question and answer video. This led them to a 15-year-long friendship, business partnership, kind of life partnership, and a cult leader status in the eyes of fans, including me. Fans endearingly call themselves fannies. It kind of sounds like a slur. I am aware, but we cannot do anything about that. And this close reading will specifically refer to Dan and Phil's relationship with their audience and the way they interacted in online spaces, but I will not delve into the detail of specific events that happened because you can find all about them with a really quick Google search, which is kind of the heart of the issue, which is queerness, or specifically the horrors of being in the closet in online spaces as content creators. Dan and Phil's strong bond is evident. They've been working together, they've been living together for the most part for the last 15 years. It's gonna be 15 in a month. And they both called each other their best friend and even more, which I will talk about during my section about Dan's coming out video. Their special bond and like this puzzle-like dynamic made their careers soar over the years because they just work so well together. And back in 2014, they made a joint gaming channel called Dan and Phil Games. But this special dynamic that works really well for them has consequences. The name Fannies, like the core audience of Dan and Phil fans, come from fan, which is the ship name of Dan and Phil. I don't know what you think about real person shipping and real person fanfiction and whatever, but this is kind of about this at this point. They were assumed to be queer before they were out, and they were assumed to be in a romantic/sexual relationship, even though they have not confirmed this, even to this day. But right now they're touring, so we will never know. I don't know. And Fanny's made a lot of art and wrote fanfiction about fan, and Dan and Phil always supported this. They even wrote their own fanfiction in their book. They're like lots of stuff that you can find online of them affirming this fan creations and like saying that they quite enjoy that and they support it. But it did not end there, because why would it? Because fans were weird. And they kind of like, there was a period of them being extremely pestered and like pressured to come out or like confirmed stuff. People asked about this to them in like live streams, question and answers, even in real life when they were touring. And you can find like the awkward moments that happened where you can clearly see them be uncomfortable. Again, with a quick Google search, that's not my place to talk about it yet. But especially like after 2012, with the big YouTube boom and like when YouTube people started getting like proper famous, everyone could think of just one question: what is going on between Dan and Phil, and what are they not telling us? And this intense speculation and the crossing of boundaries did come to an end for Dan and Phil in 2019. And their closeted status as queer individuals gains a new meaning here because they came out. In every single online space, especially Tumblr, in my opinion, fan was the one ship you can't sink, which is a joke. It's kind of an ironic one on the never explained nature of their relationship, despite how much we insist. And I think, personally, Phil touches on this in Slime, in the crafting part of Slime, because he says,
"What's the one sink you can't ship?"
Which is an interesting addition, in my opinion. Before we lay down the foundation of what I will talk about theoretically, I want to talk about Dan and Phil coming out. Because the reason I am able to talk about Slime and do a queer reading of it is that Dan and Phil are out queer individuals now. Like I said, the horrors of being in the closet for them ended in 2019. They both came out in their respective videos called Basically I'm Gay by Dan and Coming Out to You by Phil. Dan came out first, then Phil came out afterwards.
Hi, I'm gay. Ow.
Their coming out happened during their gaming channel hiatus, which started in 2018. And Dan repeatedly said that this was partly caused by his own mental health problems and problems regarding his sexuality and him being unable to come out. The gaming channel did come back this year in October 2023. And Dan clearly mentioned his reasoning for the hiatus as...
You may recall I stopped posting because I was gay.
A big gay. Sorry.
Or because I needed to accept that. This is very serious, Phil.
Sorry.
I also wanted to discover and express myself outside of the non-stop YouTube for 10 years.
This comeback was like welcomed with open arms after 5 years with the new, improved and gay Dan and Phil. And the fandom was alive during the 5 years, but they were definitely smaller. And now we can kind of see like them gaining those people back after being silent for so long. And Dan and Phil also embraced this change. Like, I think in one of the first videos, Phil says...
Alright, I saw someone say the gaming channel's coming back, except they're old, gay, and Phil can say fuck now. Which is a thing. I think I can. I've graduated into
This is a philosophical thing.
fuckland.
Oh no,
Take it back.
you've graduated into fuckland? What school did you
my
go
God.
to?
And Dan keeps saying, like, I have no fucks left to give. Like, I wrote a specific quotation on my paper, but, like, he kept saying it. There's a bunch of times where he said it.
Here we are.
We are back again. We are old, gay. I have got no fucks left to give.
They do not have any fucks left to give. We need to establish that. And I think it's worth dissecting their coming out videos, especially Dan's, because it's quite long. In a long format, emotional essay about his upbringing, sexuality, internalized homophobia, Dan leaves a big chunk to talk about Phil and their relationship and Phil's impact on his life. He says that he does not wish to discuss the nature of their relationship with fans, and it draws a really clear and hard boundary. He has drawn these boundaries before, definitely, but this time it's directly referring to him and Phil. Basically, he says,
This is when, through the magic of the internet, I met Phil. And obviously, we were more than friends, but it was more than just romantic. This is someone that genuinely liked me. I trusted them, and for the first time since I was a tiny child, I actually felt safe. And the relationship we formed at that point was something that I needed in my life. We are real best friends, companions through life, like actual soulmates. Not that souls are a real thing that exists. It's so lucky to just find someone you can be that compatible with, and especially to anyone that has experienced the kind of self-hatred that I've dealt with, one person accepting you can make all the difference. And I bet so many people want to know so much more about that, which honestly, I take as a compliment, but here's the thing. I'm somebody that wants to keep the details of my personal life private. So is Phil. I know lots of people these days, thanks to social media, want to share and monetize every aspect of their life, and then as soon as something changes, suddenly it's this huge drama because everybody got invested in the story of your life like it's a soap opera. I don't want that. I want to do certain things without an audience. I want to be spontaneous. I don't want to feel afraid to take risks. I want to enjoy totally fucking something up and not have to post a public statement about it. And if anyone thinks people really have to share these things about their life, you need to rethink your position.
and this statement basically changed the fandom forever, because it is basically a confirmation of the pair's romantic involvement at one point. We don't know now, but at one point. And it draws this boundary again, maybe for the last time. And Phil's coming out videos much shorter, it's more lighthearted, it's really lovely, and he once again draws this boundary in there. He says,
This channel for me over the last 10 years has been about being creative or entertaining people rather than sharing my personal life. I'm not going to be a daily vlogger anytime soon and broadcast myself washing my underwear to millions of people. But now I do feel like it's important to share that I'm gay because hopefully my story will help some of you.
it's clear that they don't want to talk about this in a direct way, which we should respect. But Dan and Phil are people who put so much of themselves in the work they create, in terms of especially subtext. And this is a scripted, professional, artwork, which is not like a sit-down classic Dan and Phil video. So I think it's important to read about the subtext as well, which brings me to discuss how to read queer things and how to read queer horror. This is the part where I will lay the foundation and talk about the type of queer reading that I will do and my reasoning behind it. Viewing works created by queer creators can become quite problematized because the author's queerness doesn't necessarily mean that the work itself is inherently queer, or does it? That's the question. But this doesn't stop us from trying, at least it doesn't stop me from trying. If we accept that visual texts do produce meaning to some extent, regardless of arguments about viewing competences in context, we need to decide whether these texts encode dominant meanings or whether all texts can be read anyhow, that is queerly. Which means, like, despite how a work is encoded, it's kind of up to us to see how we can decode that. But if a queer meaning is not encoded in the work, like, can we decode it queerly? We don't know. And I think the element that makes this queer close reading possible is the complete lack of heterosexual implicitness in slime. The story can be read either like completely devout from sexuality in general, let alone heterosexuality, or it can be read in a queer lens. Some texts do seem to encourage a queer viewing because the sexual images are so ambiguous. I think this ambiguity in slime relies on the lack of heterosexual narrative, or like a sexual narrative in general, as well as the use of religious and spiritual symbols, which I will talk about in a bit. Such rereadings are the product of a queer cultural moment in which images have been subject to so much renegotiation that the preferred heterosexual reading has been destabilized. I think in a post-coming out creative bubble that belongs to Dan and Phil, heterosexual implicitness and heterosexual readings in anything that they produce has already been like destabilized and completely demolished, which gives us again two routes. One of them is reading it completely devoid of sexuality as just like a lore story, or doing a queer reading using personal reflections from their lives, which I will be doing. I keep saying queer horror, I need to situate that. Queer horror, or reading horror and queer works as like kindred sister genres, is a widely studied thing. It's worthy of a discussion of its own. There are like amazing YouTube videos that I watched about it. I can link them below. But before reading slime as a queer horror, I think we need to situate it within the genre. I personally think it's more of a camp horror story, but it takes elements from found footage horror, religious spiritual horror, depends on how you read it. I think there are like clear nods to the Blair Witch Project in terms of like found footage horror. There we need to talk about something else. The simple notion of slime being a horror story without like the whole plot and everything is much more valuable to this particular analysis. Dan and Phil know their audience well, and we share a lot of interest with them. That's why we're parasocial. And especially Tumblr, again, I want to single out, has been a place of connection between these creators and us. And especially like in the early stages of Dan and Phil's career, we were communicating a lot through Tumblr. Owens locates the website's queer fascination with the occult and with like the spiritual by saying this. I might butcher it, it's a long paragraph. If both queerness and occultism have been united by a historical doubling down of secrecy, ephemerality, and evasion of official archival records, then Tumblr may represent one of the newest media platforms through which queer magical practitioners are able to turn underground economics of expression into a cyber public space decipherable and legible to those who, in typically queer fashion, are attuned to reading between the lines and cracking the code. Dan and Phil choosing this format relates directly to their audience, which they know well. Most of us are queer, and most of us are interested in alternative topics such as occultism or like Satanism or like magic. And their willingness to read between the lines doesn't escape us. And I think our willingness to read between the lines in the works that Dan and Phil do shouldn't have escaped them. Slime doesn't necessarily have explicit queer acts or references, yet the close reading that I will do will definitely situate it as a queer text point. Whether if it's explicit or implicit. So to help my argument, I will use assumptions about the entire genre to talk about slime and like to fit slime's position. Owen again claims that the Euro-American sex media became intimately enmeshed with the history of one particular occult subculture, that was also coming out of the closet, immediately preceding the following Stonewall, which is Satanism. And I think this is worth noting because there are a lot of like satanic elements, which I will not necessarily dissect, but I will mention. Here we need to talk about two theories that I will very briefly mention. One of them is the death of the author. I don't want to get into this. I didn't write about this in the paper, but it's not possible to read this without kind of a little bit sprinkling death of the author inside of everything. And the other one is Martian McLuhan's idea of medium being the message. This is like one of the most popular media studies catchphrases, the medium is the message. This directly relates to my idea of this work being a horror story, being much more important than what's specifically in it in the first place. Queer horror has seen many permutations across media and across centuries, and its treatment of queerness has been variable. From the dehumanizing use of gender and sexual nonconformity as marks of deviance and monstrosity, to more nuanced and empowering depictions and like the murky spaces in between. Regardless of the intention or mainstream reception of queer content and queer coding in horror, queer creators and consumers have often identified, embraced the presence of queerness through a kind of reclamatory, knowing and empowered lens, which is a long way of saying queerness has been depicted monstrously throughout the entire history, and despite what the general public thinks, queer people have always used these representations, even when they're bad, even when it's like the space in between. And we've kind of like reclaimed it and used it to empower ourselves. This queer fixation of why horror is the genre that we like has been approached from a number of different avenues, like Robin Wood's contention that the genre represents a return of the repressed. I'm not gonna go into psychoanalysis. I do not like Freud, and I think it just crosses the boundaries of Dan and Phil to psychoanalyze them or like try to psychoanalyze them. So I'm gonna take this idea very literally, which is the gaming channel returning from being repressed, meaning being on hiatus. The Back from the Dead rebranding after the hiatus leaves us with a literal return of the repressed. Dan and Phil are back. They're out, they're gay, and Phil can say fuck now. I'm still not getting into slime because to understand slime fully, we need to completely dissect Dan and Phil crafts in general. So I will do that now. Dan and Phil Crafts is an April Fool's channel created by Dan and Phil as a joke back in 2015. There was a clip, I don't know where it is, where they talked about like getting the idea. I think they just thought of it and like filmed it in 5 minutes and then edited it. But then it just became a lore of its own. And I think as the years went by, the meaning got deeper and more explicit, if I can say. This channel is a slightly more niche platform for Dan and Phil. They currently have 722,000 subscribers, but Dan and Phil Games right now has almost 2.9 million. So it's a bit more niche, less people know about it. And I think the current subscriber count increased a lot after the release of Slime. So basically, a piece of content holding so much meaning in a channel that's so niche is interesting. And I think this is kind of an escape from casual fans who are not like super into Dan and Phil or who are not super into fan in general. Dan and Phil kind of like use this channel to escape them and like tell a story to people who actually are willing to read between the lines and people who care more, people who are more invested in looking beyond the visuals. It's easy to read the entirety of Dan and Phil Craft's storyline as like a strong parody of YouTube, which I really enjoy. It's just basically a summary of Dan and Phil's relationship with their job titles as YouTubers, and the slowly darkening tone of the entire series is like lighthearted, yet it's very metaphor-filled. It's a journey of selling one's soul to the devil. Many fans have theorized the inner lore of the series by positioning these 4 videos in an episodic manner, which I really like reading about, but I will not talk about them because this is not the space for it. Despite avoiding those readings, I think it's important to mention that Danifil's intentional lore building and storytelling is kind of like a nod and an acceptance of the fandom's like creative endeavors, because they really like that we are creative and we try to inspire one another. Considering the 7-year gap between the first 3 videos in Slime, it can be said that Slime is affected by the first trio, but the first 3 were not created with Slime in mind because there's a long time between them. The first trio, now to dissect, they're called Square Flakes, Glitter Faces, and Potato Prints. They follow a simple script, a parody crafts channel featuring Danifil, who are not quite right, a simple and rather unaesthetic crafts project, uncomfortable dialogue, a lot of uncomfortable dialogue, and a satanic ending, let's say. There's a looming awareness of the audience's voyeurism portrayed in Danifil's behavior, which I think is really interesting and what makes Danifil crafts important. They are aware that we're watching them, and in a lot of their videos, like, they obviously directly talk to the audience, but it's never as like creepy or eerie as Danifil crafts videos. I think enhanced with, in my opinion, meticulous dialogue and a low-quality camera, Danifil turned into alternate versions of themselves, reminiscent of early YouTube, but not when they started, kind of like the gray area when they started to make money from it. Fans were really demanding, but they didn't have like quite the production technology that they do today, and like we did not have those production standards for YouTubers. Right from the first video, Square Flakes, they announced that they plan on uploading to this channel every day, twice.
There we go. That was a Square Flake. So we plan on uploading to this channel every day. Twice every day. So if you want to subscribe and become a crafty, then just click down there.
And this is obviously like a part of the joke, and I think it holds deeper meaning nonetheless, because we know now, which I will talk about, that they had problems with like consistent like grinding to upload so much to give the people what they want. The iconic phrase that haunted YouTube comment sections and the internet in general, "Don't cry, craft."
And remember, kids, don't cry, craft,
was also like coined in this video. Hello. The ideology of not crying and crafting, I think, is really important to Slime as well. It's combined with the premise of uploading 2 videos every day, paints a picture of a stereotypical YouTube channel trying to succeed in the cutthroat platform. They cannot afford to deal with their own sadness, their depression, their burnout. They just need to keep pumping out content for their audiences to enjoy. I think this is the very ideology Danifil probably had to embrace back in the day. They had like a very online life, and they had like a very close relationship with their audience, but they were closeted. And even if they're miserable because of fans who keep crossing boundaries, especially like in this era, them being in the closet, and like the speculations are all-time high, they can make videos and monetize their unhappiness, their sadness, their despair. And to this day, I think we see Danifil turning their own mental health / physical health issues into monetizable content. And I don't blame them for this, because in this new era, I feel like it is also a way for us to connect to them on their own terms. But that's also how like the YouTube algorithm works. The more work you produce, the more success you achieve. It's important to establish the personas of Danifil in the Danifil Crafts universe. They're soulless, hardworking YouTubers who pump out content until the very idea of creativity loses its meaning. In Glitter Faces, Danifil starts the video by thanking their audience, and Dan says,
"Thank you has always been our dream, the dream I've always had. And without you, I don't know how I'd feel, you know?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know.
I'm just so happy that we get to follow our dreams and just craft, you know.
Dan's crying emotional expression is far from genuine, and it's like a parody. It's really easy to see. And to talk about Phil's always the one to explain the steps of their projects, which I think hold meaning in the general universe itself. In Glitter Faces, he says,
"Draw a face on the sheet of paper representing your feelings."
This simple sentence holds meaning in relation to their career, and the relationship with their art, because their career is producing art at the end of the day, and it's just parodied on this channel. Their art has always been a way to express themselves. They're basically reminding this to the audience that they use this art. In Potato Prints, Phil adds to this notion, and he says,
"I'll be the only person to see it, but that's all that matters, because art is inside your mind. Art is what you make of it, and that is what this craft channel is all about."
This line can be read in relation to the real Dan and Phil, in my opinion, outside of their curated personas. The true meaning of their content, like the actual, this is where Death of the Author kind of comes in. The actual meaning of the content they produce is not and will never be visible to us. We will never know. It's only for them. And accepting slime as a continuation of this trio, we can kind of read this in a queer lens as well, but this probably is not like intended. But it is definitely clear that they want the audience to know about their personal connection to their work, that they take this seriously and they put a lot of themselves in it. There's not much to say about Square Flakes. It's the first video. They did it really quickly. I think in Glitter Faces, we start to see some meaning come through. It's the episode where satanic undertones begin to seep through as well. And the battle between authenticity and bowing down to the algorithm begins in this one. We slowly see Dan's persona drift into a more satanic one, which ends up in him sacrificing Phil. But this is more of a comedic sacrifice. I will refer to it as the proto-sacrifice. In Glitter Faces, after creating their designs on paper, they shake the glitter off and we see a pentagram drawn on Dan's paper. He says,
"Hey Phil, it happened again. It happened again. Phil, what do I do?"
And he looks very panicked. And Phil replies to this by saying,
"I don't know.
Why does that keep happening? Quickly, Dan, start again.
I'm sorry. Sorry."
As Dan apologizes over and over again. I think the YouTuber selling their soul to the devil for success metaphor gains a new meaning here, because looking at this content years later and now seeing them as out individuals, it's just like the idea of a mistake doesn't seem to be a joke. Because Dan and Phil crafts videos show the duo's relationship with content creation, especially the content that's related to their daily lives. Think of like a day in the life, Q&As and baking maybe even. I don't need to tell you this, but once something's on the internet, it's there forever. And even though they quickly resumed the video with Dan making the actual glitter face, like us, the audience, we saw that. We saw the mistake. And despite them pretending it didn't happen, we all saw it as a part of the narrative. And we will take it into account while talking about the craft itself. This is kind of like a nod to all pieces of content they wish they did not share, or like the worst information, the photos, the videos, and the texts that were taken from them without their consent. Dan and Phil exist on the internet and they have a big platform. Thus, whenever they make a mistake or whenever something's released without them knowing, it's there forever and they cannot start again. It's now part of the narrative. It's a part of their lives, which is really scary, I think. While we cannot make assumptions about their intentions about this narrative, like this mistake being included in the video, I think it just feels natural to read it in a queer lens. People try to out them constantly, and they have alt content from like their Formsprings, their MySpace, that they had before they were famous, and they cannot start over. Like we saw all of them, I saw all of them, and they cannot erase it even if they tried. The satanic story takes a turn for the worse in the last work, Potato Prints. The video again starts off by saying Dan and Phil Crafts is like the number 7th most popular crafting channel on YouTube now. And we all know this. 7 is a spiritual and religious number, widely known for that. And like Phil has a silly Illuminati t-shirt. It just shows their commitment to the bit, which I really appreciate. Throughout the video, Dan takes moments to like breathe heavily, be weird. This video ends with Phil's proto-sacrifice. And I think this is the one with the most reference to their struggle with content creation. While they're trying to hold on to their privacy and struggling to find the balance, or like where to draw the line between how much of their life are they going to share. They use like very conflicting lines. They say
secrets are important,
but they also say
lying makes you go to hell.
And this time Dan draws a pentagram on his own will and not a mistake like the last video. And this can be read as an acceptance of this lifestyle, and he's now becoming the perfect content creator. And he says,
what I learned is it's important to be who you are inside. Or should I say, what he wants us to be.
This is his way of bowing down to the algorithm and like becoming that YouTuber, sharing as much as he can, like as much as he could afford to say at the time, obviously without coming out. And I think it's not a reach to say that his sexuality is a part of this equation. And Dan carves the number 6 on the potato and proceeds to stamp Phil all over his body. It's fun. In this comedic proto-sacrifice, which Phil seemingly enjoys, which will be important later. We see Dan taking an active role, and this is heavily referenced in Slime. That's why I'm mentioning it. And as Phil is sacrificed, we hear sheep's bleating, which is again really important. I think it's a reference to the satanic parody cover thing that they have going on, but I think it takes a deeper meaning in Slime again. And at the very end of Potato Prince, Dan starts the iconic phrase again. He says,
creativity is nothing without friendship.
And remember, don't cry. But the craft never comes, because Phil is gone, Phil is proto-sacrificed.
And remember, don't cry.
This is important in situating Dan and Phil's like together presence. In Dan and Phil Crafts, Dan feels like he cannot continue creating without his friend, because without Phil, nothing is complete. So like, don't cry, but the craft never comes. It is finally time to talk about Slime. I called this part in my paper crafting the slime, because I think the first part is as important as the second one. Slime's release affected fans, me included, intensely, as no one was expecting a continuation on Dan and Phil Crafts after like all these years. And when you click on the link, you're just like welcomed with the extreme nostalgic Dan and Phil Crafts look. They're just like sitting in front of the camera. It's a MacBook camera. It's shitty. It's like the way it was. But there's an immediate visual difference from the other ones, which is, I think, really important. They're wearing matching outfits. And this small detail holds strong meaning in relation to Dan and Phil's like self-expression on their channels. And I think the overarching themes of friendship, love, and work are backbones of Dan and Phil Crafts. And it's important to underline the changes from previous videos in the new videos. Matching grey outfits similar to uniforms strengthens like the theme of bowing down to the algorithm / Satan in this case. As well as immediately connecting Dan and Phil on a visual level alongside the existing textual and contextual link. Neutral shirts gives a cinematic effect to the post-craft minutes of Slime. That's another story. But even in the crafting minutes, I think the shirts bring up an issue that Dan and Phil had over the years, which is joint branding. Ever since Phil is Not on Fire, Dan and Phil were experienced as a duo, like a couple, a single entity. They even got nominated for like single person awards, but the two of them, they continued to flourish with their personal solo content, but everyone like mostly knew them as Dan and Phil, like as a unit. And Dan in particular had issues with this in the past, as we clearly know. when alt content of him mentioning this is like even quickly perused, it's obvious that this discomfort stems from the fanshipping and the extreme invasion of his privacy, and like not the actual content that they do together, because it's really obvious that they really enjoy creating things together, and they still do. And the presence of these like allegations when they were closeted, and while he was also dealing with mental health issues, this was really difficult on Dan, and this can be seen as one of the reasons for Dan's personal rebrand on YouTube, like back in 2017, from Dan Is Not on Fire to Daniel Howell, which I personally think he misses it so bad and he wants to go back, but like still. In this era, we see Dan's change in style, the most notable element being his hair, because Dan and Phil's like straight fringe motif was one of the like most famous motifs that kind of signify the idea of the unit Dan and Phil.
That is why we get recognized so much when we're together in public. That symbol is just ingrained in every poor soul with an internet connection in the last 10 years. I don't care if you're a 48-year-old man Trump supporter, you know those fringes.
You know the fringes.
You've seen
this, like, him choosing to now embrace the curly hair, other than being authentic, I think it's also another step to physically separate himself from the Dan and Phil branding. And now, after all these years of physical separation, seeing Dan and Phil in matching outfits signal an immediate change in the message they want to like give their audience. And we're led to analyze the rest of this by keeping in mind this deliberate choice of embracing their connected identity as both public figures and content creators. We already talked about like the choice of medium being horror is important for Dan and Phil Crafts, and especially slime. And before we get into the actual sacrificial part, I think the first beginning is also really important, which I haven't seen a lot of people talk in that much detail. Dan and Phil's actions now seem even more curated and robotic when they're crafting. And now this is complete with the matching visuals. Keeping Dan and Phil's previous personal reflections on Dan and Phil crafts, Dan saying,
"My craft has a special purpose tonight, and I need a special ingredient,"
is important, I think. It allows us to do a close reading of the already known crafting process that we talked about. This also kind of indicates to an extent that this video might have a special purpose. And this line is included, and like every line is included for a specific reason. That's why I get to do a close reading of this. I think choosing slime, the object, as the object of the craft reflects a personal touch as well. I think the texture of slime works as like a nostalgic nod to Phil's old videos, especially Snokoplasm. Many fans, especially me, have read Snokoplasm as a queer piece of content, whether it was intentional or not. If this gets 5 likes, I will do a Snokoplasm review. Anyways, I think it's like, it kind of like has a visual reference to Snokoplasm, which is really nice. And maybe this is coincidental, but like the heavy use of knives in the video kind of reminds me of How to Befriend Your Favorite Internet Stars, which is a really old video of Dan's. The line, "My slime is a vessel," also I think encourages this viewpoint.
My slime will be fun to touch.
My slime is a vessel.
I think it encourages us to read slime context as a vessel to tell the story, woven with the physical slime's vessel duty in the sacrifice that exists within the story structure. And finally, they say,
Slime can be for anything. Fun.
Or for him.
which ties the entire thing together, indicating that the story will exist on multiple planes. There's the in-text narrative, the allegory of YouTube, and as I mentioned, my focus, the process of the ritual as a symbolism for the queer feeling of impending doom in relation to broken boundaries between content creators and their followers. Slime's main themes like all circle around each other. They keep mentioning them over and over again. So I will try to keep this mostly chronological to not confuse you. And that's why I will just keep coming back to the same ideas. Right from the beginning, Slime makes references to old Dan and Phil Crafts videos and establishes a connection between the already existing narrative. Phil says, "I've been in a box," which is how Potato Prince ended when he got proto-sacrificed.
We've had important events to prepare for.
I've been in a box.
And this assures to the viewers that this video comes after Potato Prince, like chronologically. And again, right from the beginning, we can read this as a subtext of being stuck and inability, and like the inability to come out. The format being the same as earlier videos, separate the crafting parts as a representation of the pre-coming out era, pre-2019 era. These are closeted Dan and Phil. Yet in 2024, we do know that they're out. We do know that they're gay. This creates like an interesting representation of themselves, because they're out, but they're representing themselves when they were not out. They say,
"We have returned, and so shall he."
Referencing their newly returned presence on Dan and Phil games, presumably, which brings about the YouTube algorithm demon referred to as he in this liminal space. I'm calling it a liminal because, like I said, their present situation is known by us, but they represent their older selves. So the pressure of content creation, the desire to succeed, and like the overbearingness of the fans is once again on their shoulders. The act of sacrifice is used as a metaphor for many ideas in Slime, but in these premature minutes, I think it refers to the rebirth of Dan and Phil games. And as the tutorial starts, they disclose that the channel is now YouTube's most popular art channel, indicating a rise after Potato Prince, because it was the 7th last time we saw them. And this can be a reference to their accounts growing over the years, even if the only account that was like properly posting was just Phil's own account, Amazing Phil. Realistically, it would be correct to say that Dan and Phil's audience became way more niche in the last 5-6 years. But their place in relation to other YouTubers over the years is definitely special in my opinion, because they never necessarily lost their fan base when they were gone. They never fell from relevancy in the last 15 years of their joint career, which is a big success. And on that note, the anxiety they might feel over their relevance, I think, is present in other lines in this video. Phil says,
"Running out of time and midnight is soon."
Which is an obvious reference to the satanic ritual they're about to do, but it also refers to their careers, because though still active and thriving, their audience did become more niche, and this indicates that maybe if they hadn't embraced their authentic selves or like came out, if they remained in the closet, they might have fell from relevancy, and like they might have slowly faded into obscurity as content creators. The urgency given with this line also relates to their pre-coming out selves, as discussed, and them feeling the pressure of their audience to be more authentic and to come out. They went on this journey to be themselves, but the pressure of fans were really heavy on them. We don't know, obviously, what happened in their personal lives, but we know that the fans' behavior did affect their mental health and maybe possibly halted their process of coming out throughout the years. And we kind of know that this is somewhat true. I'm going to give the example of Dan having a breakdown before going on Interactive Introverts, like the tour.
I'm sorry.
I was secretly gay.
Yes.
And I thought if I didn't address this before going on a whole world tour, I was going to have a very public meltdown. And before we committed to it, I went out onto our balcony with a blanket. I drank an entire bottle of rosé and cried for 2 hours.
You did.
I think this is just one instance of the process Dan and Phil have shared with us. And Phil even adds to this to show that it affected them quite heavily. He said,
I was having a gay panic.
The tour was like a representation of the closet, and you wanted to kick it down, but you didn't know what to do because you had to go on tour, and you're like, I want to come out, then you couldn't.
Whereas Phil's like, I'll fucking lie to anyone, I don't give a fuck.
I wasn't lying, I wasn't ready to put my toes out.
I think this further underlines how hiding their queer identity from their audience affected their creative work and creative success as well. Even Slime's most random dialogue are meticulous, and this is my conspiracy theory, kind of. I think every single sentence kind of makes sense. It just builds this narrative, and if this is not intentional, it is an insane coincidence, I will say. For example, when Phil puts his hand in the slime decoration cup, Dan says,
"Every insertion leads to more spillage."
This seems really random. It's a part of the narrative. Just like the bad graphic design and the editing, and it just strengthens the odd, weird energy that they want to achieve. But I think it means something else as well. Just like the bad text depicts the breakdown of these curated personas under pressure, these lines depict the very nature of what Dan and Phil did over the years. With every piece of new content, we analyzed it, we theorized it, we pressured them about new things. And every insertion of new content on Dan and Phil's creative universe led to more spillage of their private lives on the internet. And this is especially true in the pre-coming out era, when Dan and Phil Crafts was alive and privacy was taken out of their hands without their consent. This entrapment in the duality of wanting to create and share their lives without coming out of the closet and being closeted and pressured about it is really relevant to Dan and Phil's entire career, basically. And after coming out, Dan was the one who embraced this notion more aggressively than Phil, in my opinion, especially in his solo work. Them referencing their gayness in videos is quite common now, but I think with the jokes and everything, Dan does it more aggressively to an extent. And Phil in his personal life came out before Dan. We know this from his own coming out video. He was semi-out. He started the spillage in that sense. Yet it was Dan, when he reached that point in his life, who went fully in the thing. And as we mentioned before, Dan is usually the main actor in these videos, and Phil is the recipient, also the guide. And there's more to discuss on this, which I will again come back to. The positioning of Dan and Phil's creative platforms in relation to their lives don't stop there. Dan says,
"This is an art channel, not a language channel."
And then Phil adds on top of this, and he says,
"Insert the language."
This exchange can be analyzed as them seeing their content as a product and not always an extension of themselves. Yet their branding is historically almost always exclusively based on their relationship and their banter and people's questions about the nature of this relationship. So even though it feels a bit counterintuitive for them to complain about this, it actually makes a lot of sense because they never asked for this. And when they insert the language into the mix, which means when they come out, or put their relationship, the nature of their relationship, into words, even if it's them referring to the past, just like Dan did in Basically I'm Gay, things change. Now they have to acknowledge their audience, seeing them as a part of the product, even if that wasn't their intention in the beginning. They're not confined to little videos. They're Dan and Phil as a whole. Phil also adds to this. He says,
"I will do this for you."
Collaboration.
Which might refer to many acts Phil has taken for Dan in their creative careers, such as continuing the legacy, the Dan and Phil legacy, while Dan was on hiatus, by posting more videos, sometimes including Dan in it, because at one point we didn't see Dan at all. We were like, where is this man? Is he alive? But Phil kept including him in things, which kind of kept the Dan and Phil bubble going and thriving. And the spillage analogy continues from here. They say,
Glitter goes everywhere. Phil got some on the table, now it will spread. Once it spreads, you might as well be dead.
This innocent joke on spilling glitter and it being hard to clean up also shines light on their old fears about coming out, as well as the discourse around their relationship and sexuality in general. The glitter spilling sequence is not original in the sense that there's a sequence similar to that in Glitter Faces.
But be careful, because glitter gets Everywhere.
Also,
Everywhere.
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 Don't stay.
Everywhere.
But now it feels different because it feels like they're looking back and playing the way they were as characters. Because if one person in their audience learned about the truth, whether about them being queer or the nature of their relationship, which we again still don't know, everyone would learn and it would change a lot of things for them. So once it spreads, you might as well be dead. They don't know what would have happened if this truth came out before they were ready to share it with the world. And in this period, because of this, they had to be extremely closed off so no one knew. They just hid a lot of things and fans constantly taunted for more information. It is also beneficial to track back and analyze some visual choices that Dan and Phil made. The most noteworthy choice that they made is this.
Mix.
The black and white coloring with heavy contrast only appears for a single second, but it's rather detrimental to the plot. Dan is left completely in the dark, while Phil has a round circle of light above his head. Though it would be amusing to read this as the fandom's treatment of Phil as the small bean, angelic, innocent baby, or whatever bullshit that we were on back in the day. It is also saying a lot of things about the sacrificial plot of Slime. It's kind of a foreshadowing of his fate in this specific narrative. The light is strikingly similar to a halo used in religious artwork. He is the martyr that will be sacrificed, the innocent and holy one out of the two. And drawing from all the religious imagery used in Slime in general, it should be assumed that this 1 second long editing choice is also intentional. And this could also be alluding to the fact that Phil was ready to come out into the light, into the public light, but Dan was not. And he was also happy to be perceived as a part of the Dan and Phil duo while Dan had problems with this. He talks about this after they came back. He says,
Meanwhile, I was just sat here ready to record, I'm gay, I'm fine,
Okay.
let's do it.
but Dan wasn't ready. So in a way, Dan did sacrifice his joint work with Phil, and Phil had to accept this. This visual choice also adds the question of Phil's agency in both the in-story narrative and the queer personal subtext. Because in Potato Prince, like I mentioned, we hear sheep's bleeding when Phil is proto-sacrificed by Dan. And now seeing this halo on Phil's head before the actual sacrifice kind of paints him as the sacrificial lamb once and for all. And I will discuss this in detail again later, but it's also worthy to discuss Phil's agency in this whole thing, because we know it's clear that Phil is in on it from the start. He helps with everything. He's enthusiastic. He makes conscious, consensual choices. So this choice of putting the halo on top of his head feels like a direct jab at the audience, a jab at us, because we were so quick to paint Phil as the passive one, the one who didn't really act in this whole story, which is simply not true. The general themes that we laid out keep circling themselves in this part of Slime. They express their anxieties about content creation, but they also express how much they struggled with creating while existing as openly queer individuals. They reiterate their wishes for privacy. While it's a reference to the iconic soft and neat joke, they say,
Don't like things to be sharp. We like things to be soft.
I can't press it.
We like things to be soft.
Soft and neat!
This seems to kind of refer to the statements they also gave in their coming out videos. They don't like to discuss their current relationship in terms of concrete terms. They want things to be soft and fuzzy, while still sharing a lot about them with us. Their preference of ambiguity is clear, yet despite that, they're very articulate about the way they express their friendship on a platonic plane. They say,
Collaboration. Because remember, creativity is nothing without friendship.
This, again, iconic line from the series is kind of paradoxical, because on one hand, Dan and Phil's joint content, as well as their older efforts to bow down to the algorithm, worked, and it brought them a lot of money and success. But it was a concept that was bounding them to be ingenuine to an extent, because their friendship dynamic as Dan and Phil wouldn't have worked if they were openly queer individuals, especially back in the mid-2010s, because the social climate and YouTube and the internet in general was quite different. So we don't know how it would have played out if they were openly gay but still making content as Dan and Phil back in the day. And this is also represented by the character Dan's forced smile after saying this. Again, Dan was the one who struggled with this the most. This is what led him to work on his solo projects after his rebranding. Like, he wrote You Will Get Through This Night, he performed We're All Doomed. This pressure can also lead us to think to what extent their actual platonic friendship was harmed or threatened by obsessive fans, or like people who fetishized their never explained relationship. Things could have been really different if they had come out back in the day, but I guess now we can't really know. But on the other hand, as openly queer individuals representing their older selves now, it gives me hope, because this line can now be read as a celebration of their friendship. And they're once again together, they're once again making content together, creating together, they have matching outfits, and they're doing what they're used to doing, again together, but this time they're like much more authentic and they're happier. As the slime making process continues, things once again take a turn. Here, it's now time to fully discuss Phil's position in all of these. Though he's painted as the sacrificial lamb in this narrative, Phil is aware of the ritual from the beginning and he's quite enthusiastic about it. Just like he enjoyed being stamped and put in a box in the proto-sacrifice in Potato Prince, now again he knows about the ritual and he's enjoying the process that leads up to it. As they add Dan's blood in the slime mixture, Phil is the one that pulls out the knife first. We don't see who cuts the flesh at the end, yet we might assume that it was Phil. This act of violence on Dan can be read as Dan's rebranding process, which harmed their success as a duo, aided by Phil, who knows the consequences, yet is ready to be on Dan's side nonetheless. This small act of harm is the step before the actual sacrifice of their careers, which is the hiatus. And as the sacrifice progresses, we will once again see Phil take a really active role in the preparations, which will then give us a really strong reading through his scream, which is about to come. But right now, though only 7 minutes in, the crafting part of slime is really heavy with subtext. After the spilling of the blood, the slime preparations continue. They utter repeated references to the way they create content and the way their audience has crossed their boundaries. Phil says,
I'm going to touch.
Sharing is caring. I haven't given you permission.
This indicates that they're willing to share more of their lives with their audience, yet their boundaries are always disrespected over and over again. They want to give us things, but they don't want things to be taken from them, and they need to find this delicate balance. And the way he slaps Dan's hand after he tries to touch the slime can be read as the refusal to give the audience more than they're willing to give. Dan is reaching for something he's not allowed to touch.
It smells clean.
Can I please touch it?
Like us, the audience, and Phil just like rejects this by saying like, you will get what we give you, basically. The constant fear of being outed as queer content creators is also echoed in this part.
We love all of our crafty audience that spread the message of this channel on all the other videos, on the internet, everywhere.
Everywhere.
Everybody enjoyed that.
Dan says this while looking at Phil and forcing a smile. This direct mention of the audience show the nuanced relationship that we have with each other. They have a lot of love for us and they cannot exist. They cannot have their jobs without us existing when you think about it. This is something simple. Yet the speculations and the extent of the parasocial relationship we have, spreading and growing to this extent, is quite extreme, and it just grows and spreads, and it's everywhere, which they did not intend again. Like we mentioned, they had to become more closed off in fear of people knowing too much, knowing about their queerness, and their relationship with the audience was much more complicated before they came out because of this. Dan's deadpan voice when they say everybody enjoyed that clearly shows this, because they did not enjoy that. Dan and Phil now do something that one might say would put an old me into a coma, which they like doing now. They like to push the boundaries now that they've returned. They hold hands through the slime. And they did this before. They did this in glitter faces. They hold hands while mixing the glitter, and it's really awkward on purpose. But back in the day, it didn't stop fans from getting really excited about this and like gifing it and talking about it everywhere. So this time, this act of holding hands can be seen as a nod to their past experiences, because Glitter Faces is 8 years old. And them holding hands is a beautiful foreshadowing of the last seconds of this video. And Phil says,
Friendship.
Once again, they show their connectedness through the content they produce, quite literally. This is further emphasized with the physicality of the production as like the slime itself. Friendship is one of the main themes of Dan and Phil crafts in general, but the word friend here obviously has other undertones. It also refers to their best friends branding before they came out, and they still constantly mention and cherish their friendship, which is really beautiful. But hands connecting through the content and them saying these words hold a different meaning for the two. And the idea of slime being a cursed old internet reference, which is usually related to lower quality engagement focused content on YouTube, them making the slime and holding hands over it shows them kind of bowing down to the algorithm and bowing down to the fans and making the content that people want, like giving the people what they want, basically. The process of making the slime continues after their hands are separated. Dan marks Phil's forehead with the red slime, and he utters one of the biggest foreshadowings in the entire video. He says,
"But you will not be sat, you will be laying in the symbol."
Phil fully hears this and knows it will happen, but he kind of refuses to acknowledge it, and he keeps talking about crafting and creating content. He says,
Crafting has improved my life in numerous ways.
This can be read as the representation of how he focuses on the positives on his own content creation, especially in Amazing Phil. He fully knows that Dan will sacrifice him, but he chooses to focus on other things in his life.
I'm happy to give it to him.
Here he seems to be okay with this sacrifice. He seems to be okay to sacrifice himself to both the demon that is the algorithm, YouTube, but also to sacrifice himself to Dan in order to make him happy in his life. And right before the post-craft section starts, the duo once again leave us with this iconic line of the series, and they once again remind us.
And remember, don't cry, craft.
After crafting the slime, Dan and Phil take us to a place that we're not used to seeing from them, which is outside. They used to make a lot of skits, but most of their main content is non-fiction. They just make recreations of the events that they experienced. We don't really see any fiction from them, usually. And after the static on the screen, we're now thrown into this world that we can't understand because we're not used to it. Them being away from the house is very opposite to their branding because they don't go outside. And they still act out the personas, but something is different. Like the relaxed way of filming and the nod to found footage horror is completely contrasting to the forced, very curated personas of Dan and Phil Crafts. This is the side that we don't usually see. which strengthens my queer reading, in my opinion, because this kind of feels like we're seeing what goes on behind the scenes and what they went through when they were in the closet without us seeing what's happening. This part I'm calling the actual sacrifice. It leans more into the suspension of disbelief. We're outside and we're more immersed. We're less likely to overanalyze their actions. We lean into the suspension of disbelief. They just do things and we just watch them. But actually, they take full advantage of that, I think, and they give us a well-crafted narrative woven with all of the general themes that we talked about. And as the part of the next video begins, the full moon is out. This ties into the satanic ritual they're about to do, but also the camera slowly makes the moon look like a fake light source. It looks like there's this professional light that illuminates them. And we can infer from this that at the end of the day, Dan and Phil are content creators, and even this very personal event is put on display for other people to watch, for us to watch. This argument does coexist with the idea of now showing the behind the scenes, because now they have more control and authority over what's being shown, even if it's still a performance. This is kind of like the peak of their parasociality with their fans, which definitely goes both ways. The camera is actively part of this process. Like, throughout the video, Dan will keep doing this, but they adjust the camera before starting the ritual and they put this in, which adds to my argument. And from a negative standpoint, the camera is the watchful eye of fans, never leaving them alone, but we can also look at this a bit more positively. Them adjusting the camera and choosing where it points kind of shows the control that they now have over the surveillance. Them taking their own Dan and Phil Crafts lore and adding their personal journey and acknowledging the camera is a kind of a meta exploration of being an online persona, because the most intimate acts, even a sacrifice, are done with a camera in mind. Dan and Phil are now in front of the fire and they're carrying out this burning ritual. Historically, we know that fires are places of storytelling, arts, religion. The sacrificial religious references are there. But Phil, the sheep, the subject of the sacrifice, or more like the object of the sacrifice, is also an active participant, which is interesting. We see them outside of their house, their comfort zone, in the wild. They're creating this story together and sacrificing their joint content quite literally into the fire. They put the earlier crafts in there. They put the square flakes, the glitter, and the potatoes. And then this is followed by them pouring the red slime they made earlier in the video. Right after the fire ritual, we're now transported to daylight, to a foreign place that looks quite secluded. We see Phil working with a blank stare, almost like he's possessed, and Dan is filming him. This act can be interpreted as a possible representation of the hiatus era, because even though Phil always continued to make his own content and expressed joy over making said content, we do now know that he kind of felt a little bit off during this time. Normally, I try to not add stuff that comes after the slime to make my analysis more believable, but I'm gonna add this specific thing from Pizza Mukbang 2 because it really does support what I thought in the first place. In the video, Dan clearly indicates that he wasn't intending to come back after the hiatus, and while talking about his undetermined period of absence, Phil says this.
And obviously I was a bit sad because I was like, I like this. I don't want to not do this, but I also wanted you to be happy. I didn't want you to do something that didn't feel right for you, you know? You should always follow your dreams and your heart and your musty pizza. I did my own thing as well, kept doing Amazing Phil. I did feel a little bit lost in those years because I was like, what's going on? What is me without Dan and Phil?
Following the soulless work, we also see Dan starting to do his own preparations. And this eerie energy of the place they're in is enhanced with the use of sound, especially a lot of footsteps and a lot of breathing. and they hang up a small figure all in black, and the camera, which is presumably on Dan's hand, zooms in to the figure, and the visual cuts out to the sky caged by this structure. And this cage-like motif after this transition can be read as a representation of Dan's mind almost, because the sky is blue and the beautiful world is out there, but he's in a cage, he's looking up, and he's feeling trapped. When both Dan and Phil get inside the shack, the preparations truly start. Them slowly preparing for the ritual together mimics the way they create content. They set the mood, they decorate, they prepare the ingredients, but most importantly, they do all of these things together. The meaning of the ritual as a stand-in for the separation of their joint branding is something I will discuss, but it's also important to highlight how they still do this together, even when it's something that will affect both of them tremendously and mostly negatively. Phil reads something from a book, which is in the in-text narrative, which is probably like instructions for the summoning or something. And he also contributes to the sigils on the wall. And this once again shows Phil's involvement and contribution in the whole thing. And even within the Dan and Phil Crafts bubble, again, Dan is the main player. He's the one who acts. But Phil, despite being the one who's acted on, he's also the main instructor. And he always leads the crafting process, even if he's the one getting affected by them. This dynamic, I think, faintly mimics Dan and Phil's YouTube careers in a sense, because Dan followed Phil's path. Phil's an old YouTuber. And even though Dan followed Phil, he, after some time, surpassed him in terms of numerical success and became more active in the sense that he was more talked about, he was involved in more projects, he was more known in the public eye. But their joint content was always more favored by the fans, which was more enthusiastically embraced and initiated by Phil himself. In the hiatus period, Dan was again very active in the separation of his brand from Phil, but he was also supported by Phil all the time. Certain details of the preparation process also seem rather deliberate, considering their usual attention to detail. The implications of the supplies that they use to prepare the ritual doesn't necessarily benefit my queer reading, but how they use them kind of does. For example, while writing runes on the wall, Dan uses his right hand. We know that Dan's left-handed. It can be discussed that this decision could be done for visual balance because of the positioning of the camera, but I can also assume a lot of subtext in this, because this is kind of a repetition from the older crafts videos, again, in Glitter Faces. In Glitter Faces, Dan does ask,
I did it wrong.
If you're left-handed, ask a friend.
Why am I left-handed?
and Phil replies to this and he says,
Everybody makes mistakes.
while this topic is worthy of its own discussion, it is known that historically, like being left-handed was something that was frowned upon, which was associated with wrongness and witchcraft and many other things. In the context of Glitter Faces, this just seems to be like a joke to make the narrative funnier. But in Slime, I think they always take the alt content and give it a more profound meaning. So Dan purposefully using his right hand before the sacrifice can be read as him fully succumbing to this curated persona, conforming to the societal norms that are expected from him. He might be using his right hand and omitting the left, aka faintly like not behaving queerly, to appease everyone and to act right and straight just before the ultimate sacrifice, which will resolve him of all of the pretense. And in a moment that seems very voluntary and not like a requirement for the sacrifice, we see briefly Dan playing the piano. And it's known amongst fans that the piano is Dan's thing, and that's something he does for himself, and Phil doesn't usually participate. And Phil is still there. He sits in the background and he watches them. The spotlight is not on him, but he still doesn't leave Dan's side. These few seconds take the role of a celebration of some sorts. Dan's solo work being highlighted, but Phil still not leaving his side. This moment seems to be just for them. It's like Dan is humoring Phil one more time before he goes on to sacrifice their joint act of creation, kind of. And the references to the idea of jointness and separation are really present through this entire sequence. We see them film themselves together through the mirror, and then it glitches, and now Dan is on his own. There are other repetitions of this where we see Phil momentarily, only for him to disappear, and this visual choice kind of strengthens the idea of the sacrifice being the act of separation, the separation of their branding. Dan is now on his own, and he's reflecting on what he wants to do by himself, basically. This is visually supported by moments of him sitting alone, presumably filmed by Phil, and he seems to not know what he's doing necessarily. And then they open up a curtain, which brings the sacrifice closer. We then see Phil staring straight into the camera and just yelling, "No." No! And while aware of the sacrifice because he helped Dan do it, he seems to not want the sacrifice to happen, but he still lets Dan do it either way. All of the themes that we laid out while preparing for this sacrifice now comes together in like the actual act of the big sacrifice. Phil knows what's about to happen, but he still goes in. And Dan, as someone who owes so much to Phil, knows that he has to go through with this big sacrifice. And before taking his last step into the room, he takes a moment to himself to hesitate maybe, but then he still takes the last step because he's determined to get what he wants. I think a really important visual choice done by Dan and Phil here is to not show the act of violence, the act of separation. The main act of killing and the separation of their joint creative bubble is not for the viewer to bear witness to. It's done behind closed doors, and their journey of coming in terms with their identity, both creatively and in the queer sense, is not for our eyes to see. This kind of echoes the wishes in their coming out videos as well. We don't have the right to bear witness to what happens in their private lives, in their crucial moments. Their emotional turmoil belongs to them, and this is similar to Greek plays where we don't see violence take place on screen. We only get to hear of it and then see its effects, but not the event itself. This is made clear by the fact that Dan sets up the camera specifically to point at that direction and then looks at the camera and then walks away into the room where we can't see them. The audio in Slime mostly works to set the tone of the whole work, like we mentioned, like the footsteps, the breathing, the sheep. But it's also really important for the storytelling in The Big Sacrifice because of Phil's screams of agony here. This gives us an idea of what happened behind these closed doors, and we talked about this in detail. Phil's awareness and support in this separation, in this action, was clear from the beginning. Yet despite this, like the rawness of the scream kind of allude to the idea that even though Phil was in on it, he was still not sure whether Dan was gonna go through with it or not. The scream kind of marks the hiatus and Dan leaving YouTube, doing his own thing, trying to define his own self as someone who's not related to Phil in terms of branding. And from Dan's perspective, Phil's screams can be like a theatrical recreation of a moment where he told Phil about their impending separation. And in his own perspective, he has to kill Phil in order for them to go on their own creative directions. It's possible to interpret this scene in different ways as it happens not before our eyes, and again their wish of keeping their personal agony private comes to play here. They don't want us to know more than what they're willing to show us. And the thing that they decided to show us is those harrowing screams. Them taking a violent approach in this section in their storytelling is not really surprising. While Phil's sacrifice is not a direct metaphor for queerness, the reason it happens ties back to the way Dan and Phil were known and their branding and the hardships they faced around their closeted existence in the public eye. And I want to give a quote here. The linking of homosexual potential with danger is not new. Within the development of cinema, the queerness or the implied lesbian or gay potential of a character ran concurrent with their murderous motives. If we interpret Phil's murder as the start of the hiatus, this is a point where they're not out as queer yet, not to the public. And this murderous act from Dan foreshadows this queer existence. But since this is a reenactment of events, this reenactment that we already know about kind of twists this foreshadowing into like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like the violence itself in this way marks them as queer individuals and strengthens the queer implications of what's about to happen after the sacrifice. Dan then comes out of the room and he looks harrowed. There is a blood print of a hand on his shirt. Phil tried to hold on to him even as he was presumably bleeding to death. And the symbolism behind the handprint and it being right on top of Dan's heart seems very deliberate, showing Phil's final acceptance of his own sacrifice, even if it comes to him as a shock, hence the screaming. Dan's distressed look makes it clear that he's not happy about this, yet he still went through with it and surprised Phil through this. Dan sacrificed Phil and not himself or someone else, because Phil is the most important thing for him personally. And their relationship in all possible layers, whether it be romantic or strictly business, Phil is really important to him. And Dan is harrowed because he had to sacrifice the thing he cares about the most and the thing that he was most familiar with. Phil kind of defined him, and he had to sacrifice this in order to be able to move on. And in all of those planes, Phil is his everything, which explains a lot. After Phil's sacrificial death, the ceremonial sacrifice begins. It's, I think, possible to call this a ceremony attended by many people, as Dan again deliberately sets the camera looking straight into the area, and then he looks straight into the camera, thus acknowledging the audience. He approaches Phil, laying on a pentagram surrounded by candles, and then he gets to work. We once again don't see him carve out Phil's heart specifically. The camera cuts to static. This is probably because of visual concerns, but it still does tie perfectly into the idea of this act being private to them and not for us to see. Dan taking Phil's heart out so violently, from the audience's perspective, is the biggest betrayal. And the act of carving out a wound symbolically is really important. Mythically, the wound as opening is also a gateway to potential transformation and a window on encapsulated history. This is the point where everything Dan and Phil went through reaches its climax. All the pain that they have endured, their encapsulated history is shared directly with us. This is a pivotal moment, and it's like the start of something new for them. It should also be noted, I think, that the idea of an open wound also suggests the idea of care. We must look into a wound and not neglect or evade it, says the Book of Symbols. For them, Phil's open wound opens up this period of reflection that further leads to them healing and a new start. Dan and Phil games coming back. Dan doing this in front of an audience suggests accountability. The treatment of Dan and Phil was closely tied to their fan base, and their cleansing and route to healing must also happen under their watch. in order for things to be able to come full circle. After taking Phil's heart out with his bare hands, Dan once again talks directly into the camera. He talks to us. He says,
"Hello, crafties. Art is important. Soft and neat. Creativity is nothing without friendship. Don't cry. Craft."
After putting Phil's heart into a vessel, he actively smears Phil's blood on himself as well as Phil. And the smearing of blood is closely tied to the act of slaying/murder. Historically, the symbolism goes back to ancient times, Cain and Abel being one of the most remarkable examples. When one is marked with smeared blood, he must live the full measure of his days with the knowledge that, no longer innocent, he must master his hot blood with awareness. Dan must now live with the consequences of his actions. He came out, he sacrificed Phil. We can also underline the use of bodily fluids, in this case blood, and the act of stabbing physically as metaphors for sex, which is a really long-lived tradition in queer horror in general. There's a lot of examples you can find. By meshing these ideas together, Dan and Phil leave us with a scene of living with consequences as well as pure queer expression. Dan directly addressing the audience again, and once again saying art is important and creativity is nothing without friendship. They gain a new meaning in this moment of sacrifice. This seems to be a nod to the fandom's creativity in general, and Dan and Phil supported and encouraged us since day one, like we said. Even if people consistently crossed their boundaries, they still appreciated and encouraged creativity, even when they were at their rock bottom. The recurrent emphasis on friendship ties back into Dan and Phil's professional relationship, which in turn is dependent on their really close personal bond, because Dan can't create without Phil, and Phil will always support him in these endeavors. But looking at the grand scheme of things, it seems that Dan wants to create alongside Phil, and they want to create together. Over the remains of his dead branding and the separation from Phil over this entire crime scene, Dan comes out. Him getting up and summoning the demon is the transition to the next period of their life, the period where they publicly came out and faced the responses of their fans and the general public. This is now the future, and then the scene cuts to black. Slime ends in the most vulnerable state Dan and Phil have probably ever shown themselves in. Phil is now back from the dead, and they stand on the pentagram holding hands. This is the first time we properly see them hold hands throughout their entire careers, and they're looking straight into the camera. They're not laughing, they're not crying, they simply exist, and they're themselves. It's a powerful image, and different from all the sides of themselves that they have shown us before. This is the final step in their journey of authenticity, in a sense. Dan's hand over Phil's mimics the way they sign autographs. It's a small resemblance, but it further connects their relationship and the creative work they do together. It fits perfectly. They went through so much as closeted people under intense scrutiny, yet they came out strong, determined, and unapologetically themselves. This imagery does not really prove anything in regards to the nature of their relationship, but the implications are there. And the picture they paint suggests a resistance and a will to exist, but this time they want to do this together. Hands have been a symbol of connection since the beginning of humanity, And like, despite all the content oversaturation that we have, at least for me, I still get emotional when I see like the handprints on caves and stuff. So this is such a loaded and strong symbolism for them to highlight and use in this sense. So I cannot overlook their position, basically. Dan and Phil deliberately hold hands for the first time, showing the strength of their connection. We can say that hands are specifically employed in language as supplement or substitute for lips and mouth, which means what Dan and Phil do not want to say out loud, they gesticulate to us. In this striking placement, Dan and Phil hold other objects beside each other's hands. Phil holds the knife and Dan is holding Phil's heart. Both of these objects hold tremendous significance in terms of their comeback. As yet another symbol with universal and historical significance, Dan holding Phil's heart is really telling. The Book of Symbols again says that the heart's undeniable physical centrality to our existence has its correspondence in the undeniable reality of our emotions, our feelings of affection, desire, and delight, as well as rages, fears, and vulnerability. By holding Phil's heart, Dan is holding the core of what their relationship is all about. For many, the heart's power was so valued that it was ritually sacrificed and fed, still throbbing, to the sun god. The heart, like the sun, is the central source of life, the seat of power, courage, and strength. From a queer perspective, Phil's heart that is ripped out by Dan is what gave Dan the courage to come out. The solo work he did, aided by Phil's unconditional support, made him want to return to creating together, to doing things together again. And now he has this power and courage to be more authentically himself. This symbol does have another layer of meaning though, which is accountability. It comes from ancient Egypt. Before the deceased were allowed to enter the underworld, they were judged in front of Osiris. The heart was weighed against the feather of Maat, goddess of truth and justice. If it was heavier or lighter, it was not in harmony. If it weighed the same as the feather, then the deceased was declared true of voice and granted eternal life. Phil is now resurrected, which means his heart weighed the same as the feather. And taking this into account, he's metaphorically given eternal life now, because despite everything, he was on the true path, which is Dan's side, and he helped him find the courage and the authenticity, while he was also doing the same by coming out at the same time. It being held by Dan and not Phil shows this responsibility on Dan's hand in terms of their joint success, because Dan's sacrifice heavily did affect Phil. And he was the one to disrupt their success via the hiatus. It's presumably still heavy on him, holding Phil's heart, the very soul of the person who is his best friend, companion through life, actual soulmate. And this shows how connected they are as individuals. Even though Phil was sacrificed to the demon, the heart is in Dan's hand, and it's never given to the demon, but it's never given to us, the audience, either. This is kind of another boundary that they have put up to protect the nature of their relationship. They don't disclose what it is to us. The true meaning of the heart is alluded to, but it cannot be reached in its entirety. It's special to Dan and Phil. Only Dan gets to hold both Phil, the essence of his soul, and their journey. Now it's time to talk about the knife. The knife is implicated in the perverse intimacy of compulsive self-mutilation and the seeking of aliveness through pain. Yet here the meaning is simultaneously embraced and disrupted. The aspects of pain and destruction through the sacrifice, like the queer aspect of this, is really present, obviously. Yet Phil himself holding the knife shows a subversive type of acceptance. He's brought back to life, and he does not want to exist without Dan. There's no apologies, there's no anger. He does the most disruptively intimate thing that a sacrificial lamb can do. He's holding the knife that killed him. This is pure acceptance. And he embraces the destruction that the two had to undergo. for a chance of rebirth and acceptance, which has now succeeded. This, along with the active involvement in the sacrificial preparations, make Phil a special type of sacrificial lamb, like we said. While Dan is the active agent in slime, Phil also came out. And he also went through everything that Dan went through, and he also came out stronger than he was before. Holding the murder weapon here is painted as this big act of love. With the knife and heart in their hands, they hold on to each other, and Dan and Phil reclaim their nature as a unit, as a duo, as partners, and as fighters, really. They're now more authentic and unapologetically queer. They're back from the dead. It's now kind of appropriate to address the demon in the room. The in-text narrative is quite clear. Phil is alive again. And the meta-narrative also suggests a queer rebirth. And from a career perspective, this is the point where Dan and Phil Games is back from the dead. Yet through this rebirth, they also have another figure by their side, which is the demon. The demon was previously established as a stand-in for YouTube and success, as well as social normalcy. But now the queer subtext is added on top of it. And a general pattern seen in queer cinema is death and helplessness. Yet this image, this final image, is far from dead and helpless. It's very alive and it's very subversive. It's fruitful to use Butler's idea of gender and queer performativity to analyze the scene, and relating this imagery to the idea of queer performance. Gender identity is instituted by repetitive acts, then queer performance is not expressive of the social identity, but is, rather, the reverse. The identity is self-reflexively constituted by the performances themselves. At some time, the actor must do something in order to produce the social visibility by which the identity is manifested. Even the act of coming out is constituted by an institutionalized speech act. We can suggest that queer identity emerges as self-consciousness of one's gay and lesbian performativity sets in. The presence of the demon, who so far was the main antagonist of Dan and Phil Crafts, is now less threatening, and its positioning behind Dan and Phil suggests a union of some kind, which I will analyze further. But as the idea of queer performance goes, taking the demon behind them is disruptive to the general culture of queer cinema in general. The demon doesn't bring death, it doesn't bring misery, it brings life and power. Dan and Phil's refusal of queer expectancy is one of the main strengths of slime. It's very subversive. The ideas of performance creating identity is emphasized in a way that we don't really see often. On a simpler plane, their coming out journey in its language, being gay, and products does follow a stereotypical emergence of the need to perform. Yet when it comes to the nature of their relationship and their queer existence as a duo, they flat out refuse to perform. And since performance breeds identity in this argument, their relationship once again cannot have an identity. It stays unidentified, it's blurry, it's not accessible by the audience. And in this moment of return, they have full autonomy over which parts of the equation they want to share with us, and the decision is quite clear. From people trying to out them and their joined at the hip branding, their creative journey and relationship in every sense of the way has now come full circle. Phil came back, but so did the demon. And as we mentioned, even in this moment of pure strength and reclamation, Dan and Phil still cannot exist without the demon who caused their downfall in the first place. It is now time to revisit one of the most important key players that we've been kind of avoiding, who are the audience. Hello. The choice of the Baphomet, or simply a demon, is appropriate in terms of a parody that borrows from Satanism. But the choice of a demon holds a very specific meaning to Dan and Phil. The obsessive fannies who heavily contributed to the hostile environment Dan and Phil were subject to, especially before they came out, were mostly known as the demon fannies. And with the added queer text in slime, the demon ceases to just be YouTube, it's also us, the audience. The demon rises behind them and it looks scary, but it's now on Dan and Phil's side, not against them. Them looking directly into the camera with the demon behind them is kind of like a representation of their existence alongside the people who made them suffer in the first place, the parasocial, obsessive demon audience. But now fannies have mostly changed, and as years have passed, the core audience has grown with Dan and Phil. Now, the demon fannies of previous years are supporting them against all others who watch from a distance, who are ready to judge them. With this imagery, especially as they look directly into the lens, they acknowledge their core fans directly. They call them out for the pain that they caused, but they also accept their change and they welcome them to their side. Their main queer core audience grew up alongside Dan and Phil, and they came out alongside them as well. And now we created this queer community together. And we now quite literally have their back. There's this acceptance from both sides concerning this deep and parasocial relationship. And as the lighting changes, the bloodstains on Dan and Phil's shirts seamlessly blend into the demon's hands, and his wings kind of protect them in an embrace. We don't know what happens in the in-text narrative, but it doesn't really matter at the end, because they're together, we're on their side, and they have reclaimed full autonomy over their art and relationship despite everything, and this is all that matters to them. The power of slime as an artwork comes from its density of meaning and symbolism, in my humble opinion. And even after dissecting this whole main narrative, we can still delve into visual details and extract more emotion and symbolism. And the last symbolism comparisons I want to do here are tarot cards. I want to do them because Phil is kind of known to read tarot and predicting Dan in his future.
The future. The Knight of Wands. So some guy who's going to have a big impact. An energetic warrior. He has a hasty personality and he's very quick to love or hate. Interesting. I'm glad it wasn't like death.
And I would like to believe that he is psychic. But jokes aside, we do know that they have this base knowledge of tarot cards, so it can be discussed whether this is intentional or not. But especially the last imagery, I think, is worth looking into. We're going to specifically look at the Lovers and the Devil. The visual resemblance to these cards are both thematically appropriate and related, like I said. And we can start with the Lovers. The Lovers is the sixth card of the major arcana. It represents love, passion, unity, and choice. In the most well-known deck, which is called Rider-Waite deck, the two lovers stand side by side, with an angel behind them, wings enveloping to protect the couple. The visual resemblance of the angel's wings with the demon's wings and slime is striking. The themes of love manifest as queerness and the love between the two. Passion is represented through the violence of queer horror, and unity relates to the reclaimed joint identity, and their ability to make choices is what thematically drove them to this specific ending. And the Lovers give news of collaboration and communication and balance for the future. But on the other side of the spectrum, there is the Devil card, which is the 15th. The Rider-Waite's Devil stands in opposition to the Lovers. It means the other, it means unbalanced love and sin. The other as a concept is heavily tied to queerness, just like how the cultural idea of sin is. Satanic and sinful imagery is commonly used in representation of queer love in horror films. And the unbalanced love in the picture Dan and Phil paint, I think it's the parasocial unhealthy relationship between us. In the Devil card, the figures are tied together by chains. In the Lovers, they don't touch. For the middle ground, Dan and Phil hold hands, and it just joins these two cards together. They're together, but not by force. Looking at the figures behind these couples in these cards, we see that in the Devil does not touch them. But in the Lovers, we see an embrace of the angel watching over them. The demon of Danenfil holds them in an embrace despite being an evil symbol. So this imagery kind of is a mix of the angel and the devil, bringing them together. The devil becomes the angel that blesses this reunion. And just like the fans who took Danenfil's side, this opens up a space for them to keep creating. This is where I sum up my thoughts. First of all, I did not write this in the paper again, but I want to say most of these could be coincidences. I don't know Dan and Phil. They don't know me. And I would like to believe that most of these things were intentional because they fit so well together, but they might as well not be. But that's why we mentioned the death of the author. And even if we don't go with a theory that's as heavy, it's still most of the works we interpret and close read. It doesn't matter how heavy the implications were on the author's side, because we can always put our own meanings on top of it. And this is something personal, but I find that really beautiful. And that's why I like slime so much. Even if some of these details were not intentional, they fit in this narrative to create something really beautiful. And now I'm just strictly gonna read my finishing paragraph, which I've titled A Love Letter. Slime is a love letter. It takes the horrors of existing online as closeted queer individuals, and in turn tells the tale of redemption. It is impossible to do a queer analysis of this work without delving into the creative universe and personal relationship Dan and Phil have. Their creative drive and their occupation intrinsically ties their work to their queer identity. Only by studying their history, we can pinpoint their queer references, which are craftily incorporated in this parody queer horror film. Their redemption is not one born out of spite, though. It is one born out of love. At the end of the day, this subversion of queer horror brings hope for the future. A future where Dan and Phil exist authentically, represent themselves without hiding their queerness, hand in hand, in peace with us, their audience. It is acceptance from both parties involved. Slime is a love letter Dan and Phil wrote to themselves, after everything they've been through, but also to us. It is a work of love. Hello from the editing zone, I guess. So I wrote this paper right after Slime came out, and then I recorded it. And then I am unfortunately employed, so I just forgot about it, and I've been editing this. It's been a while. It's been a year and a half, actually, since the original video came out, so I don't think this is relevant anymore. But I still really enjoyed writing this and recording this and editing this, so I want to share it nonetheless. If you somehow watched all of this, thank you. I hope you enjoyed. Sorry for my shit editing skills. I don't care that much. But yeah, I am setting myself free from the concept of slime, and I will be happy. So have a nice day.